The galaxy had rules for war, not suggestions, not guidelines that powerful species could ignore when things got inconvenient. Real rules, written down, agreed upon, signed by 61 different species across 11,000 years of shared history. The rules covered everything: which targets were acceptable, which weapons were too much, how long a war could last before a neutral party could step in, how many civilians you were allowed to leave alive when you took a planet. There was even a rule about that last one. You always had to leave some. It wasn't kindness, it was logic. You left survivors so they could carry the message back, so the losing side's government could hear from real mouths, real people, what resistance had cost. It made the negotiations cleaner. It made surrenders faster. Everyone saved time. Everyone saved money. The galaxy had figured this out a long time ago, and the system worked, and nobody important had questioned it in centuries. The Vorkai hegemony had never violated a single rule. In 11,000 years of Concordat history, the Vorkai had fought 19 wars. They had won 16 of them. They had lost 2, accepted the terms, and rebuilt. One had ended in a draw that both sides quietly agreed to call a draw. Because the alternative was admitting neither of them knew what had happened. They were not cruel. They were not reckless. They were, by every measurable standard, the most disciplined military power in the known galaxy. Their fleet formations were studied in academies across 30 star systems. Their logistics were legendary. Their war masters wrote books that other species generals kept on their shelves. They did everything right. That was, it would turn out, the problem. Kessler's Rock was not an important planet. That was the first thing the Concordat observers noted in their initial report. It was a mining world, mostly iron and a compound the humans called Kesslerite after the geologist who found it, which was useful for building certain kinds of engine shielding. The population was around 40,000, miners and their families mostly. A few teachers, a few doctors, a mayor named Hollis Brandt who had run unopposed 3 elections in a row because nobody else wanted the job. It sat near the edge of what the Concordat maps labeled emerging species space, the polite term for the parts of the galaxy where newer civilizations were still figuring out how things worked. Humanity had been in that category for about 200 years. They'd had faster-than-light travel for 80 of them. By galactic standards, they were practically newborns. The Vorkai had a territorial claim on a resource corridor that passed near Kessler's Rock. The claim was old, documented, technically valid under 3 different Concordat frameworks. Humanity had built a refinery station that the Vorkai said crossed into their corridor by 0.4 light minutes. 0.4 light minutes. The Vorkai sent a formal notice. The humans sent back a formal response that said, in the careful language of diplomacy, that they disagreed with the survey data. The Vorkai sent a second notice. The humans sent a second response. This went on for about 8 months. Then the Vorkai fleet arrived. It came in the middle of the night cycle, by the colony's local time. That was not deliberate cruelty, it was just when the transit window opened. The Vorkai War Master, a veteran named Sorath Vel, had no particular feelings about the humans sleeping when he arrived. He had no particular feelings about the humans at all. They were a minor species in a territorial dispute. This was a job. The fleet was not the Vorkai's largest. It didn't need to be. 32 ships, well-armed, well-crewed, following a battle plan that Sorath Vel had used, variations of 11 times before. He gave the colony a 1-hour warning, as required by Concordat law. He specified which settlements were designated targets and which were not. He listed the civilian evacuation corridors. He did everything the rules required. Then he did what the plan called for. The refinery station was gone in 4 minutes. The settlements around it took longer. The people in them who hadn't reached the evacuation corridors, some of them hadn't made it in time. Some of them hadn't understood the warning was real. Some of them had simply frozen in the way that people do when something impossible arrives without any personal context to put it in. Those people are in the official casualty count. The number is 8,312. Sorath Vel's report noted it as within acceptable parameters. The Concordat Charter agreed with him. He left 1 settlement standing, as required. He left it with food, medical supplies, communication equipment, as required. He sent the formal notification of terms to humanity's nearest diplomatic station. Then he waited. He expected negotiations within 30 days. He would keep waiting. The survivors of Kessler's Rock reached the diplomatic station on the 4th day. Most of them were in shock in the clinical sense, the kind where the body keeps moving and the eyes keep tracking and the mouth answers questions. But something behind the eyes is still back on the ground looking at what used to be a house. The footage from the colony's surviving cameras was transmitted to every human government within 48 hours. There were 312 of those governments. Every single one of them watched the same footage. What happened next was the thing the galaxy had not predicted, could not have predicted, had no historical framework for, because it had simply never happened before. All 312 of them agreed on something. The Concordat ambassadors arrived at the Human Diplomatic Center on Earth 12 days after Kessler's Rock. There were 7 of them, representing the Council's senior members. They came with condolences, which were genuine. They came with a reparations framework, which was standard. They came with a proposed negotiation timeline and a suggested mediator from the Trail species, who were known for their patience and their neutrality and their ability to sit in a room for 6 hours without anyone's blood pressure rising. They were met by Admiral Yuan Chen. She was 61 years old. She was not tall. She had the kind of face that looked like it had decided a long time ago to stop wasting energy on expressions that didn't mean anything. She had served in 3 of humanity's internal conflicts before humanity reached the stars, and then in the 2 minor territorial skirmishes after, and she had the kind of stillness that people get not from peace but from having seen enough that most things no longer surprise them. She sat across from the 7 ambassadors in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Geneva. The room smelled like recycled air and the particular staleness of spaces where serious conversations happen too often. Outside the window, the city moved around in its ordinary way. People doing ordinary things. Clouds going where clouds go. The senior Concordat ambassador was a Keth named Orath Sen. He was, genuinely, a good person by any reasonable measure. He had spent 400 years in diplomatic service. He had helped end 2 wars. He had written a paper on conflict resolution that was considered essential reading across the Concordat. He sat across from Yuan Chen with real sorrow in his 4 eyes and said, in careful, translated standard, that the Concordat recognized the tragedy of Kessler's Rock and wished to help humanity find a path forward. Yuan Chen listened to all of it. Then she asked her question. What's the fastest a species has ever gone from their first major war to their last one? Orath Sen blinked. He had not been expecting that question. He thought about it honestly, because that was his nature, and he answered honestly. 312 years. The Vel conflict cycle. Though the conditions were, thank you, Yuan Chen said. She looked at the table for a moment. We'll need less time than that. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has shifted and everyone present can feel it but nobody's sure yet what shifted, or how far. Orath Sen said, carefully, Admiral, the Concordat's position is that the territorial dispute that preceded this incident is one that can be resolved through. The territorial dispute, Yuan Chen said, is not what I'm talking about. She stood up. We'll be in touch about negotiations, she said. When we're ready. She left. The 7 ambassadors sat in the recycled air for a while. Then Orath Sen said, to no one in particular, I don't think they understand what the Vorkai are. He was right. He was also wrong. What the Concordat did not know, what no species outside humanity's own history knew, was that humans had been doing this to each other for a very long time. Not the same as the Vorkai. The Vorkai were disciplined, precise. They followed rules. Human warfare, across 40,000 years of recorded and unrecorded history, had been something else entirely. It had been personal and savage and creative, in ways that the species inflicting it sometimes couldn't fully explain afterward. Humans had fought over land, over water, over which group of humans had the right version of a story about the sky. They had invented weapons, and then invented better weapons, and then invented ways to survive the better weapons, and then invented responses to those responses, cycling forward in a loop that never quite closed. They had never managed to wipe themselves out entirely, not for lack of trying. What this meant, and this was the thing that Concordat's analysts would spend years trying to put into a framework that made sense, was that humanity's military tradition was not one tradition. It was 312 traditions, cross-pollinated, argued over, layered on top of each other across millennia. Every trick that worked, every counter to every trick, every lesson from every disaster, absorbed into the collective memory of a species that had been its own worst enemy for most of its existence. They knew how to take a planet back. They knew how to hold a city block by block. They knew what to do when they were outnumbered, outgunned, outsupplied. They had been there before. They had been there so many times that the strategies were old, tested, sitting in institutional memory like tools, in a drawer that hadn't been opened in a while, but were still sharp. The Vorkai were better, by any formal measure. The Vorkai were also fighting one version of this. The first human response fleet launched from 3 different staging points simultaneously, 22 days after Kessler's Rock. It was not as large as the Vorkai fleet. Not nearly. The Vorkai had centuries of consistent military development. Humanity had 80 years of spaceflight, and the particular aggressive competence of a species that had learned, through terrible experience, that being unprepared was a kind of death sentence. The Concordat observers watching the launch filed their reports. Human fleet composition, unconventional, mixed generation ships, multiple design philosophies, no single dominant configuration. Assessment, likely inefficient coordination. 2. Note, human forces appear to have accepted a casualty projection range that this observer's models would classify as unsustainable for most species. Recommend revised modeling parameters. End. Second note, human fleet is moving faster than optimal approach trajectories would suggest. Unclear if this reflects navigational error or deliberate choice. Investigating. It was deliberate. Yuan Chen had looked at the optimal approach trajectories, the ones the Concordat observers expected, the ones the Vorkai would expect, and set them aside. She used a different one. It was older than spaceflight. It was the kind of move that didn't appear in any formal tactical manual, because it was the kind of move that looked insane until it worked. In the old land wars on Earth, people had a phrase for it. They called it, going where they ain't looking. Back on Kessler's Rock, in the one settlement Sorethvel had left standing, a man named Darren Hollis, related to the mayor, third cousin, sat outside his house every morning and looked at the sky. He wasn't waiting for anything specific. He was just looking. He had been in the settlement when the attack came. He had heard it, seen the light from it through his window, done the thing where your body moves before your brain catches up, and found himself under his kitchen table with his arms over his head, which would not have helped with anything but was what his body decided to do. He had survived by being in the right part of the settlement. His brother had not survived by being in the wrong part. He didn't talk about that. He didn't talk much at all anymore. The humanitarian supplies the Vorkai had left were adequate. The communication equipment worked. The medical people who had been flown in from the nearest station were kind and professional. He sat outside every morning and looked at the sky. One morning, 26 days after the attack, the sky looked back. Not the Vorkai. He knew their ships now. He would know them for the rest of his life. These were something else. He stood up from his chair. He didn't know what to feel. He wasn't sure he had the right equipment for it anymore. But he watched the shapes moving up there. Human ships, his species' ships, and something in his chest that had been very flat and very still for almost 4 weeks did something small. Not hope, exactly. Something colder than hope. Something that would do. Sorethvel received the report about the human fleet's approach 7 hours before they arrived. He was not worried, exactly. He was something more precise than that. He looked at the fleet composition data, the numbers, the configuration, and he applied everything he knew, which was considerable to the question of what this meant. He had fought 15 species in his career. He knew how they fought. He knew their stopping points. He knew when they would take a deal and when they wouldn't. He knew the shape of their anger and the shape of their grief, and the point at which those things became negotiating positions. He looked at the human fleet. He ran his models. His models gave him answers that he didn't trust, because the answers didn't match any behavior pattern in his database. So he ran them again. He adjusted the variables. He refined the assumptions. The models gave him the same answers. He sent a message back to the hegemony's command. It was not a panicked message. Sorethvel did not panic. But it had a quality to it that his communications officer noticed and didn't mention. The message said, "Request updated behavioral projections for human military units under sustained engagement conditions. Current models appear insufficient." 38. Also request any available historical data on human internal conflict doctrine. All of it. Whatever exists. He set the message aside and looked at the approach data again. The humans were not coming in the way he expected. They were not coming in the way anyone would expect. He was beginning to understand, the point. In Geneva, in the room that smelled like recycled air, Orath Sen sat with 2 of the other ambassadors and looked at the transmission feeds from the Kessler system. He watched the human fleet move. He had 400 years of experience. He had seen wars start and end and start again. He had sat in rooms with species who were angry, species who were desperate, species who were calculating, species who were bluffing. He had never sat in a room watching a species that seemed to have made a decision so complete and so total that there was nothing left to negotiate with yet. Like watching a door close that you hadn't realized was open. "We should file a formal observation request," one of the other ambassadors said. "Under Article 14. Remind them of the conventions." Orath Sen watched the feed. "We will," he said. He didn't move. "Give them a moment first." Outside the window of the Geneva building, the city moved. People walked. Clouds drifted. A child on the street below was arguing with a parent about something that looked, from 14 floors up, very urgent and very small. Orath Sen watched the human fleet close the distance on the Kessler system. He thought about the 8,312. He thought about what Yuan Chen had said. "We'll need less time than that." He was 400 years old. He was very good at reading rooms, and reading species, and reading the specific kind of quiet that meant something was already decided. He started drafting a different kind of message. Not to the Vorkai, not to the council, to his own people, back home. Filed quietly, marked low priority so it wouldn't flag any attention. A note for the record. It said, "Today something changed. I am not certain yet in what direction, but something changed. If you are reading this later, you will know what I mean." He sealed it and sent it and turned back to the feed. The human fleet had arrived. The war, the real one, the kind that doesn't have an expected shape, had just started. The first report Sorathvel sent back to Vorkai Command after the engagement began was 3 words. "They don't stop." His communications officer read it twice before transmitting it, because it didn't sound like a War Master's report. It sounded like something a frightened soldier would say, but Sorathvel was standing right there, waiting, and so the officer transmitted it, without changing a word. It was the most accurate thing Sorathvel would write in the next 6 months. The thing about the Vorkai was that they were excellent at war the way it was supposed to be fought. They moved in coordinated formations that centuries of tactical refinement had made nearly perfect. Their ships communicated in layered, encrypted bursts that were faster than anything humanity had developed yet. Their ground forces, because it came to ground forces. It always came to ground forces, regardless of what happened in space. First drilled to a standard that their academies called precision, and that the Concordat observers called remarkable. In every report they'd ever filed about a Vorkai engagement, they took Kessler's rock's orbital space inside 40 minutes of the human fleet's arrival. The human ships were good, but not as good. Not yet. And Sorathvel used the gap the way he always used gaps, methodically, without waste. He felt the engagement settle into familiar rhythms. He had been here before, in different systems around different planets, and he knew the shape of what came next. The shape did not come. The human fleet retreated from the orbital contest the way a hand pulls back from something hot, fast, clean. No heroic last stands. Sorathvel watched his sensors and waited for them to regroup at the system's edge, which was what any rational force would do, which was what his models projected. They regrouped at the system's edge for 4 hours. Then they came back from a completely different angle. Not the logical angle. Not the angle his defensive positioning had accounted for. The angle that a Vorkai tactician would have dismissed as wasteful, because it traded efficiency for unpredictability. And efficiency was how you won wars. Unless, Sorathvel was starting to understand, you were fighting a species for whom efficiency was a secondary concern. They lost the orbital contest again. Then they came back, 3 times in 30 hours. Each time from a different position. Each time with something slightly different about their approach. Not random, Sorathvel could feel intelligence behind it. A learning process. Someone on the other side watching what worked and what didn't, and adjusting mid-thought. But unpredictable in the specific way that made his models keep coming back with answers he didn't trust. His crew was good. They held. But he noticed, on the 29th hour, that some of them were doing a thing he had not seen Vorkai crew do before. A small thing. A subtle thing. They were glancing at the sensor feeds when they didn't need to. Checking the approaches. Not because their jobs required it. Because they wanted to know where the humans were. Sorathvel said nothing about it. He filed it in the part of his mind where things went when they were important, but not yet fully understood. He sent a second report to command. It was longer than 3 words this time. It contained casualty numbers, positional data, fuel consumption reports, all the standard information. But at the end, in the flat neutral language of military communication, he added one paragraph. Human forces do not respond to losses in a manner consistent with established models. Expected behavioral indicators of strategic retreat threshold, increased communication, traffic, defensive consolidation, reduced offensive, sortie frequency, are absent. Current assessment is that either our threshold models are incorrect or human forces are operating under a decision framework that does not include a retreat threshold. Recommend the latter assumption until proven otherwise. Command wrote back in 12 hours. Acknowledged. Continue standard engagement. Behavioral anomaly noted. Will review. Sorath Vel read it. Set it aside. Went back to watching the approaches. On the ground, the situation was different in the specific way that ground situations are always different from space engagements. More personal, more complicated, more dependent on the particular humans and the particular Vorkai soldiers who happened to be in the same patch of land at the same moment. The Vorkai ground forces were, if anything, more impressive than their fleet. They moved through terrain the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance, adapting, never forcing, when flowing was available. They had taken the planet's main settlement zones in the first push, following the bombardment that cracked the human defensive positions open. Clean, fast, professional, the humans retreated into the terrain. This was, initially, not concerning. Species retreated into terrain. You pursued, you consolidated, you waited for the supply lines to become a problem, and eventually you negotiated from a position of obvious advantage. Except the human supply lines didn't break. They had cached supplies in places that made no tactical sense, until you realized that making tactical sense was not the priority. What mattered was that the caches were somewhere the Vorkai wouldn't think to look. Old mine tunnels, sealed geothermal vents, gaps in rock formations that satellite imaging had logged as geological features rather than potential storage. They had done this before the fleet even arrived. Before the war started, technically, someone had looked at Kessler's rock and thought, in a systematic and unhurried way, about where to put things if it ever came to a ground fight. Sorath Vel's ground commander sent a message that used the word prepared in a tone that made clear it was not a compliment. The Concordat observers were legally required to be there. It was in their charter. They documented all sides of any conflict involving Concordat members, which humanity was, technically, even if they were still in the emerging category. 2 observers were stationed with the Vorkai forces and 1 a young Trell named Sev Oren. On his first assignment, very thorough, very meticulous, had gotten permission to embed with the human units on the ground. His reports were unusual, not in a dramatic way, in the quiet way of someone who is very carefully describing something they don't have quite the right words for. Day 4. Human forces conducted 3 separate counterattacks on Vorkai positions, after what this observer's military advisors had described as critical losses. In each case, the forces involved were smaller than the Vorkai units they engaged. In each case, the counterattacks succeeded in disrupting Vorkai supply operations. When asked afterward how they had managed this given the force disparity, the human unit commander, Sergeant D. Oze, age 31, veteran of 2 previous engagements, shrugged and said, "We've had lots of practice being outnumbered." This observer did not have a follow-up question prepared. Day 9. Witnessed what the human forces call an improvised defensive line. The materials used included stripped panel plating from a damaged human vehicle, rocks, several kilometers of cable, retrieved from an abandoned communication installation, and something the soldiers called good intentions, which appears to be a humor reference this observer does not fully understand. The line held against a Vorkai push that should, by standard models, have broken it. This observer's models are being revised. Day 14. Attempted to quantify the morale state of the human unit I am embedded with. Standard indicators, communication frequency, eating patterns, sleep quality, humor response, are difficult to apply. Humans appear to use humor at moments that this observer would classify as high stress, which is the opposite of what the models predict. When this observer noted this, the same Sergeant Osei said, "What else are you going to do?" This observer is still thinking about that. Sev Oren's reports were flagged by 3 different analysts at Concordat Central as methodologically sound, but emotionally uneven. They were placed in a file and noted for review. Nobody reviewed them for several months. Elena Vasquez had been 19 when she shipped out. She was from a small city in Manitoba, Canada, Earth. A place with long winters and a hockey tradition and a practical, no-nonsense way of looking at the world that she had absorbed the same way she'd absorbed the cold gradually. Completely. Until it was just part of how she worked. She had signed up because her older brother had signed up and because she had, at 19, a clear sense that something was happening and a less clear sense of what she personally was supposed to do about it. The recruiter had asked her why she wanted to serve and she had said, honestly, someone has to. Which was not the most inspiring answer but was the true one. She was assigned to a ground unit on Kessler's Rock as part of the second wave. Not the first responders, the ones who had gone in while the orbital fight was still happening, which had been a very bad time to be on the ground. Elena's unit landed when the orbital situation had stabilized into something that could generously be called contested. She was good at the job. That was the first thing her unit commander noted. She was quick. She listened. She made decisions fast without making them carelessly. Some of it was aptitude. Some of it was the particular quality of attention she'd had since childhood. The ability to be entirely present in a moment, while also tracking what was happening around the edges of it. She killed someone on the 4th day. Vorkai ground soldier, coming around a rock formation, no time for anything except the training to take over. She filed the report. She ate dinner. She didn't sleep well. She filed that fact under expected and moved on. By the end of the first month, she was sleeping fine. She didn't think too hard about what that meant. There was no time to think hard about anything, which was, she understood somewhere underneath all of it, probably a mercy. She wrote home when she could. The letters started out normal, she was okay. She missed them. The food was whatever food in a field unit was. Functional. Over the weeks the letters got shorter, not because she had less to say, because she had more, and less of it belonged in a letter home. She stopped apologizing in them. She hadn't noticed she used to until she noticed she didn't anymore. The psychological campaign started on day 38. The Vorkai had used it before. It was effective, documented, refined across 19 wars. You broadcast imagery of the enemy's losses, their destruction, their dead. You personalize it, where possible names, faces, homes. You let the grief compound. You let the fear compound. You watch morale soften, and then you offer terms that sound reasonable compared to the alternative you've just made viscerally real. They broadcast the Kessler's Rock footage, the original attack, the settlements, the numbers. They had their own recordings, cleaner than the colony's surviving cameras. They transmitted it on every available frequency, to every human unit and human ship and human receiver in the system. There was a silence after it that Soreth Vel measured at 47 seconds. Then humanity broadcast it back. Not a response, not a message. Just the same footage, same images, same numbers, transmitted from every human ship and every human ground unit simultaneously, aimed back outward, back at the Vorkai fleet, back at every Concordat observer channel, back at the open frequencies that reach deeper into the galaxy. With one addition, text, simple, 11 words in standard, the trade language, everyone used. This is why we are still here. We remember. The Concordat observers received it, logged it, transmitted it. Sev Oren, on the ground, was sitting with Sergeant Osei's unit when it went out. He watched the human soldiers. Some of them were looking at their comm screens. Some weren't. Elena Vasquez was checking her equipment. Methodical, unhurried, as if the broadcast hadn't happened. Sev Oren said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Isn't it hard? Seeing it again?" Elena didn't look up from her equipment. "Yes," she said. She kept checking. Sev Oren wrote it down. He wrote it down exactly, without interpretation, the way his training required. But he underlined it, which his training did not require. Soreth Vel watched his crew after the broadcast came back. He watched them receive the 11 words. He watched their faces do the thing faces do when they process something unexpected. Not fear. Something more complicated than fear. He had been a war master for 60 years. He had conducted psychological campaigns successfully against 4 different species. He knew the variables. He knew the vulnerabilities. He knew the moments when a morale operation shifts the balance and the other side starts to soften. He had expected humanity to soften. They had not softened. They had, and he turned this over in his mind very carefully, trying to name it correctly. They had taken the thing he sent at them as a weapon and held it up and said, "Yes, this, exactly this. This is the reason." He filed his 3rd report. It was the longest one he'd written. It ended with something that was, for a Vorkai war master, almost unprecedented. Not a recommendation, not an assessment, a question, filed in the flat neutral language of military communication, that nonetheless read like something else entirely. What does a species do when you show them what they've lost and it makes them fight harder? He did not expect command to have an answer. He was right. On day 61, the Concordat sent a formal request for humanity to stand down, pending negotiations. It was transmitted to every human commander in the Kessler system, to every human government, to Admiral Yuan Chen directly. It cited 3 articles of the Concordat Charter. It offered the services of 4 different neutral mediators. It expressed, in careful diplomatic language, the Council's concern that the conflict was escalating beyond what the original territorial dispute warranted. It was a reasonable document, well written, genuine in its intent. Yuan Chen received it on the bridge of the Perseverance, read it once, and handed it to her communications officer. "Log it," she said. "Response?" the officer asked. Yuan Chen looked at the forward screens, at the system spread out ahead of them, at the work still in front of them. "Acknowledged," she said. "That's the response." The officer logged it. Acknowledged. Where it remained. The war did not stop. Elena Vasquez wrote one more letter home around that time. It was shorter than the others. It said she was okay. It said she didn't know when she'd be back. It said tell her mother not to worry, which was a useless thing to say to a mother, but she said it anyway. At the end she wrote, "I'm good at this. I don't know what that means yet. I'll figure it out when I'm home." She sealed it and sent it and went back to work. Outside the field unit's shelter, the terrain of Kessler's rock stretched in every direction, rock and dust and the particular gray-red color of a world that had never been beautiful and didn't apologize for it. 2 moons. A thin atmosphere. Wind that tasted like iron when it came through the filters wrong. She had stopped noticing any of it. That, she supposed, was what getting good at something meant. Somewhere above her, in the contested orbital space, Vorkai ships and human ships continued their back and forth. Somewhere beyond that, in the clean vacuum between worlds, the wider galaxy was watching, and counting, and beginning, slowly, to revise the things it thought it knew. The war was 61 days old. It felt, to everyone involved, both much longer and much shorter than that. On a map, it was one system, one contested corridor, one mining world with iron in the ground, and 40,000 people, who had mostly been trying to live ordinary lives, in the space where history was being made quietly, without ceremony, in field reports and broadcast transmissions, and the small daily decisions of soldiers on unfamiliar ground. Something was taking shape that none of them had a complete word for yet. Not a victory, not yet. Something that moved like one. In 11,000 years of concorded history, no species had ever struck a Vorkai interior world. Not because no one had the ability, not because no one had been angry enough, because the shape of war did not reach there. There was an understanding, unwritten but absolute, that certain things simply did not happen. You fought on the edges. You fought over the corridors and the resource claims and the disputed moons and the trade routes that cut through contested space. You fought where the fighting was supposed to happen. You did not take the fight to a species home. That was not a rule in the Concordat Charter. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of thing that had never needed to be written down because it had never been done. 11,000 years. 61 species. 19 Vorkai wars. Not once. Humanity had not been informed this was the shape. Or rather, they had been informed. The Concordat had sent 3 separate diplomatic communications in the 4 months since Kessler's Rock, each one noting, with increasing clarity, that certain escalation thresholds existed and that the galactic community expected them to be respected. The communications used words like norms and established precedent and collective understanding. Yuan Chen had read all 3. She had acknowledged all 3. She had filed them next to the first one. The order came on a morning that looked like any other morning on the Perseverance. The ship ran on a 24-hour cycle, synced to Greenwich Mean Time, because someone had made that decision years ago, and it had stuck. The lights came up at 6. The galley started serving at 6:30. The crew rotated through their shifts with the quiet efficiency of people who had been doing this long enough that the routine had become its own kind of gravity. Yuan Chen came onto the bridge at 7. She looked at the tactical displays for 4 minutes. She drank her coffee. She set the mug down in the exact spot she always set it. Then she gave the order. 8 words. Take us to the Vorkai interior. All wings. She did not raise her voice. She did not pause for effect. She did not explain, or justify, or preface it with anything. Her navigation officer looked up from his station, just for a moment. Then he looked back down. Yes, Admiral. The Perseverance turned. Behind it, the fleet turned. All of it. The Concordat emergency session convened 14 hours later. 14 hours was the fastest it had ever convened in recorded history. After due, the previous record was 3 days, set during the Marin collapse, which had been the worst crisis the Concordat had faced before now. Every seat was filled. 61 species, some of them represented in person, some by holographic projection from systems too far to reach in time. The assembly hall on the Concordat's neutral station was designed for moments of crisis. The architecture was deliberately calming, high ceilings, soft light, the kind of space that was supposed to help people think instead of react. It was not helping. Orath Sen, the Keth ambassador, stood at the central podium. He had not slept. He was 400 years old, and he had not slept, and it showed in the set of his face. In the careful way, he was choosing each word before he said it. The Concordat cannot permit this, he said. If humanity strikes the Vorkai interior worlds, we cross a line that has never been crossed. A line that exists because every species in this hall understands what happens when it doesn't. Wars without limits do not end. They compound. They become the kind of thing that takes generations to recover from, if recovery is possible at all. We built this institution to prevent exactly this. And he stopped. He looked at the gallery, where the observer representative sat. The human delegation must be contacted, immediately. With the full weight of this council behind the communication, they must understand what they are doing. There was agreement in the hall, the kind of agreement that fills a room quickly, because everyone present wants to believe the problem is one that can be talked through. A young man stood up in the gallery. He was 23 years old. He worked a desk job at the Human Diplomatic Mission, the kind of job that involved filing and scheduling, and making sure the right documents reached the right offices. He had never spoken at a Concordat session before. He had never spoken at anything before, publicly, not like this. His hands were doing something complicated at his sides that he was trying to make them stop. He said, with respect, The room turned to look at him. He sat back down. Then, because he had started, and he was going to finish whether his hands cooperated or not, he stood back up. We didn't start this, he said. We asked to negotiate for 8 months. We followed the procedures. And then they came to our world. They told us where we could run, and they killed the people who didn't run fast enough. And now you want us to stop. He stopped, swallowed. I'm not authorized to speak for the government. I'm just saying, we didn't start this. 1. He sat down. For good this time. The room was quiet. Orath Sen looked at the young man for a long moment. Then he said quietly, I know. And that was the part that nobody had a good answer for. Because he did know. He had known since Kessler's Rock. The Vorkai had followed every rule. The Vorkai had done everything correctly, and 8,312 people were still dead. Knowing who was in the wrong and stopping a war were, it turned out, very different problems. Soreth Vel received word of the fleet's movement in the standard communication cycle. He read it. He read it again. He sat for a moment that his communications officer would later describe, in a private account filed years after the war, as the only time I ever saw the War Master look like he was solving a problem he didn't have a solution to. Then Soreth Vel stood up and began issuing orders. Defensive repositioning, recall of forward units, emergency resource allocation for the interior stations, the machinery of a military responding to an unplanned situation, not panicking. Professionals don't panic, but moving faster than comfortable, with the particular focused energy of people who have just understood that the ground is different than it was. He sent a new report to command. It was the shortest one he'd written since the first. They are coming here. He did not add anything to it. He did not add context or assessment or recommendation. Command would understand. Command wrote back in 6 hours. Confirmed. Prepare defensive formations. Diplomatic contact with human fleet authorized. We are reaching out. Soreth Vel read that last line. We are reaching out. 60 years as a war master. 19 engagements. He had reached out once, in the early stages of his career, when a conflict had gone somewhere unexpected, and a negotiated resolution had made more sense than the alternative. He remembered the weight of it, the specific quality of sitting across from the other side, and being the one who had opened that door. He had not expected to be in that position again. He had certainly not expected to be in that position with humanity. The fleet crossed into Vorkai interior space on a Tuesday, by Earth reckoning, which meant nothing to the Vorkai, but was noted in the human logs, with a small, dry observation from Yuan Chen's communications officer. Another Tuesday, for the history books. What it looked like, from the outside, from the Concordat feeds, from the sensor arrays of neutral observation posts, from the perspective of 61 species watching in real time, was a column of ships moving through space that had been, until this moment, absolutely safe. What it felt like inside the fleet was harder to name. Elena Vasquez had rotated off Kessler's Rock 6 weeks earlier. The ground campaign there had settled into something that needed fewer soldiers and more administrators, which was its own kind of victory. And the units that had been there since the beginning were redistributed. She had been reassigned to a ship, the Meridian, a mid-sized cruiser with a crew of 400 and a commanding officer named Captain Raza Nand, who had the useful quality of explaining things once and then trusting you to remember them. She was not doing anything dramatic when they crossed into Vorkai interior space. She was in the maintenance bay, running checks on the sensor array her section was responsible for, because the checks were scheduled and the schedule mattered regardless of where the ship was. One of the other techs said, quietly, "We're in their space now, the home space." Elena didn't stop the check. "I know," she said. "Doesn't that feel strange?" She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it. The way she'd started thinking about things directly, without dressing it up. "Everything feels strange now," she said. "I've stopped using that as a reason to stop moving." She finished the check, logged it, moved to the next one. The cost of the war, at this point, was considerable. The Concordat analysts who were tracking it because they tracked everything, that was their job. The documentation was, the institution's memory had compiled numbers that were difficult to look at without needing to do something with your hands. Human casualties, across all theaters, had passed a number that would have, in any previous galactic conflict of this scale, indicated the approaching end of a species' viable military capacity. The analysts had a term for it. Culmination point. The moment when losses outpace replacement, when the will to continue encounters the arithmetic of continuing, and finds that arithmetic insuperable. Humanity had passed their projected culmination point 43 days ago. They had not culminated. The analysts revised the model, applied new variables, ran it again. The new model said they would culminate in another 30 days. That projection would also be wrong. On Earth, and on the colony worlds, and on the ships and stations where humans were not fighting, other things were happening. Quieter things. A generation of children growing up with the war as background noise, as a fact of the world, the way weather was a fact. Factories that had shifted from civilian production, families with gaps in them that rearranged themselves around the gap because the alternative was to stop functioning. A birth rate that dropped, for the first time in 2 centuries, by a small but measurable amount. Nobody held a ceremony for that number. Nobody put it on a memorial. But it was there, in the data. A small, quiet thing that meant something the data couldn't fully hold. Yuan Chen knew the numbers. She looked at them every morning with her coffee. She didn't look away from them. She also knew the other numbers. The territory recovered. The Vorkai positions that had shifted, retreated, reconfigured, moving from the aggressive posture of the early war to something more defensive, more reactive. The change in their communication patterns that Concordat intelligence had flagged as significant, and that humanity's own analysts had a shorter, blunter name for. They were scared, not panicking. The Vorkai didn't panic, but something in their decision-making had changed, some calculation at the center of their strategic thinking. And what had changed was the variable they were most uncertain about. That variable was, when would humanity stop? They didn't have an answer. Their models didn't have an answer. Sorathvel's reports, which Concordat intelligence shared in redacted form with neutral parties, didn't have an answer. Yuan Chen had an answer. She kept it in the part of herself that was not for reports or briefings or the conversations that happened in well-lit rooms with recycled air. The answer was, when it's done. Not when the models say. Not when the culmination point says. When the thing that started on Kessler's Rock, in the settlements that no longer existed, among the 8,312 people who had been given an hour's warning and told where they could run when that thing was finished. when there was no version of the world in which it could happen again. That was when the Vorkai envoy request came through Concordat channels, as required by protocol. It was, the Concordat made very clear in their transmission, a significant moment. The Vorkai had requested ceasefires before, in their history, but always from a position of offering them, not requesting them, never requesting them. The specific phrasing of this communication, routed through 3 different neutral intermediaries, used a grammatical construction in Vorkai that the translators noted had no common application. It was a form used in very old texts, formal to the point of being archaic, the kind of thing you used when the weight of what you were saying needed the weight of old language to carry it. The meeting was arranged for a neutral station, equidistant from the current front lines, 1 representative from each side, no weapons. Concordat observers present as required. Yuan Chen went herself. The envoy was not Sorath Vel, he was still in the field, but a senior diplomatic officer named Keth Soral, who was old by Vorkai standards and had the particular bearing of someone who had prepared very carefully for this conversation. They sat across from each other at a table that the station's designers had made deliberately simple. No flags, no symbols, nothing that would give either side more visual weight than the other. Keth Soral began by acknowledging the losses on both sides. He used specific numbers. He was, Yuan Chen observed, being honest, not performing honesty, not using it strategically, but actually meaning it. The Vorkai dead were real to him the way the Kessler's Rock dead were real to her. She waited until he was finished. Then she slid a document across the table. 1 page, clean margins, standard diplomatic format. Every word chosen precisely. Keth Soral looked at it. He read it once. He read it again. He looked up at her. Unconditional, he said. Yes. You understand what you're asking. You understand what you did. The room had the particular quiet of a place where recycled air is the only sound. The Concordat observers were doing the thing observers are trained to do, which is be present without being participants, which is harder than it sounds when the air in the room has this kind of weight. Keth Soral looked at the document. He had prepared for negotiation. He had prepared for terms, harsh ones. He'd known they would be harsh. That was expected. That was manageable. Terms were something you worked with. Terms had language you could move within. This was not terms. He picked up the document. He held it. He looked at it for a while longer. I will need to transmit this to command, he said. I know, Yuan Chen said. The response may not be immediate. I know that too. Keth Soral folded the document carefully. He put it in his case. He stood, because the meeting was done in the way that certain meetings end, before anyone explicitly ends them. He paused. For what it's worth, he said. Kessler's Rock was not meant to be what it became. The parameters were within accepted convention. We did not anticipate. I know, Yuan Chen said. Her voice was completely even. That's part of the problem. Keth Soral left. Yuan Chen sat in the quiet room for a while. The observers stayed, because they were required to document the full session, and the session was not formally closed. She didn't appear to mind them. She looked at the table where the document had been. She drank the last of her coffee, which had gone cold. Outside, in the vast and indifferent dark between stars, the fleet waited. In the Concordat assembly, a different conversation was happening. Orath Sen had gone back to his office after the emergency session. He had slept, finally, the sleep of someone who is tired enough that the weight of things becomes briefly irrelevant to the body's needs. He woke with the same weight waiting for him, which was expected. He had 400 years of experience. He had seen 7 wars. He was sitting at his desk looking at the feed from the neutral station, the summary, not the full transcript when his door opened. The person who entered was not old. She was 41. Her name was Veth Kara, and she was a Keth military officer, not a diplomat, which was itself notable because military officers did not typically have business in the senior ambassador's office. She closed the door. We need to talk about what comes after, she said. Orath Sen looked at her. The war isn't over yet. It will be, she said. And when it is, we're going to have a humanity that just did something that has never been done, in our space, with the outcome they're going to get. She sat down without being invited to, which he noted. We need to decide what that means. For the Concordat. For the balance. Before it happens, not after. Orath Sen was quiet for a moment. You're making calls, he said. Yes. To whom? She met his eyes. The ones who need to be in the room when this is over. Orath Sen looked at his desk. At the feed. At the summary of a meeting in a neutral station, where two people had sat across from each other, and one of them had put a single page on the table. "They haven't won yet," he said. "No," Vethkara agreed. "But they will." She stood. "And then we'll have to figure out what kind of galaxy we're living in now." She left. Orathsen sat for a long time. Then he started making calls of his own. War's end. This one ended on a Tuesday. By Earth reckoning, which meant nothing to any of the 61 other species watching, but humanity was the one counting, so it was Tuesday, 8:14 in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time. Overcast in Geneva, which was where the formal transmission was received, and where the staff on duty in the diplomatic center had been awake since 3, because they had known it was coming and had not wanted to miss it. The armistice was transmitted through Concordat channels, as required. All the right language, all the right signatures. The document was 47 pages of formal galactic legal text and 3 pages of actual terms, which is how these things always work. The language takes longer than the substance. Humanity's 312 governments received it simultaneously. The responses varied. Some people cried. Some people said nothing and went outside and looked at the sky. Some people got very loudly happy in the way that is almost indistinguishable from grief if you're watching from a distance. Some people did not respond at all because they were in the part of themselves that was still elsewhere, still on a ship or a planet or a stretch of contested ground, and would be for a long time. In a building in Geneva, the duty officer who received the transmission looked at it for a moment. Then she stood up and walked to the window and watched the city begin its ordinary morning. People, going to work. Delivery vehicles on the streets. A group of school children crossing at a light, shepherded by 2 adults who were paying the kind of focused attention that adults pay to children in traffic. She watched the children reach the other side. She went back to her desk, filed the transmission, made coffee. The signing ceremony was held on the Concordat's main neutral station, the same one that hosted the General Assembly, the same soaring ceilings and soft light, designed to help people think instead of react. It had been used for 5 armistice ceremonies in the past 2 centuries. The staff knew the protocol: flowers on the table, or the nearest equivalent that the participating species could agree on without it becoming a diplomatic incident. Good chairs, cameras from every Concordat member state, because the documentation was required, and also because everyone wanted to see it. The Vorkai delegation arrived first, which was their custom. Keth Sorrell led them in. He had handled the final negotiations. All those long weeks of working through the language of the document, and he walked with the careful dignity of someone who is carrying something heavy and has decided the only option is to carry it well. Then the human delegation. There were 11 of them, Yuan Chen at the front, and behind her, a mix of military officers and government representatives from several of humanity's larger administrations. They were dressed correctly. They walked correctly. They took their seats. The room went quiet, not the formal quiet of ceremony, not the respectful hush of an occasion with proper protocol. The other kind, the kind that happens when 61 species of observers and delegates and staff, all trained to manage their reactions, all experienced in the business of watching history happen without making it about themselves. All of them went still at once, because the human delegation walked in, and the room remembered, collectively, and without discussion, what it had watched them do. Yuan Chen sat down. She looked at the table. She looked at the Vorkai delegation across from her. Keth Sorrell looked back. Between them, on the table, was the 47-page document, and the 3 pages of terms and all the flowers that were not quite flowers. The ceremony proceeded as ceremonies do. The words were said. The signatures were given, each one in the order and manner required by charter. The Concordat senior recording officer announced the armistice and its effective time and date, for the record, for the 11,000 years of precedent that now included this. When it was done, Keth Sorrell stood and extended his hand across the table, a gesture he had learned from humanity, researched, practiced, because he had wanted to use something of theirs. Yuan Chen looked at it for a moment. She shook it. The cameras recorded it. The observers recorded it. 61 species, through their various feeds and transmissions, received the image of the handshake in the hall, with the soft light. Nobody had a fully adequate response to it. The archivists began compiling the official war record the same day. This was also required by charter. Every Concordat conflict was documented, the full record, both sides, all data available, preserved for the institutional memory. That was the Concordat's longest and most serious project. The record for this war took 14 weeks to compile. It was 11,000 pages. The previous longest record was 4,000 pages, for a conflict that had spanned 12 systems and taken 60 years to resolve. This one had taken 14 months. The archivists had no framework for some of what they were documenting. They created 47 new tactical categories to describe human operational approaches that didn't fit any existing classification. Several of the categories had sub-entries that referenced other categories in circular ways that the head archivist found professionally embarrassing but could not resolve. Because the reality was circular, humanity's strategies interacted with each other and evolved in real time in ways that resisted the clean lines that a proper record required. The casualty mathematics were reviewed 3 times. The first time, the reviewing committee thought there had been an error in the data aggregation. The second time, after the correction processes had been run, the numbers were the same. The third time, the committee chair sat with the numbers for a long while and then wrote in her notes, not for publication, just for herself. These are real. I have checked. They are real. The Vorkai losses were, as expected, catastrophic. That word appeared in the formal record twice, in different sections, written by 2 different archivists who had not seen each other's work. Both of them used it. Both of them were correct. The Vorkai would spend 2 generations rebuilding. The shape of their civilization would be different afterward, in ways that were not yet clear, but were already inevitable. The human losses were larger, in raw number, than any single species had sustained while still winning a conflict in the Concordat's recorded history. That sentence sat in the record like a stone. The archivists noted it, documented it. They did not editorialize the record, was not the place for editorializing, but in the analysis section, which was the closest the record came to interpretation, the lead analyst wrote a paragraph that was read, in the years after, more widely than any other single passage in the 11,000 pages. Standard models for predicting military culmination points rely on the assumption that sustained losses will, at some threshold, produce behavioral changes that indicate reduced capacity or will. This assumption held for all 19 previous Vorkai conflicts, and for all documented major conflicts in Concordat history. It did not hold in this case. Human forces sustained losses that exceeded the projected culmination point by significant margins without demonstrating the expected behavioral indicators. The analyst's position is that this is not an anomaly requiring an adjustment to the models. It is a fundamental data point about the species. They were not operating under the same relationship between loss and cessation that the models assume. Why this is the case is outside the scope of this document. It is, however, perhaps the most important question the Concordat should be asking. Nobody formally responded to that paragraph. It was read by a great many people. Elena Vasquez came home on a transport ship that landed in Edmonton. In the early morning, fog sitting on the tarmac like something that hadn't made up its mind yet. She had been gone 14 months and 11 days. She was 21 years old. Her mother was there. Her mother had the face of someone who had been holding something carefully for a long time and was now trying to put it down without dropping it. She hugged Elena the way you hug someone when you have made a private deal with the universe about what you want in exchange for everything you'd given. Elena hugged her back. She said she was okay. She mostly meant it. The reintegration assessment was scheduled for a week after landing. Standard procedure for returned military personnel. A room, a qualified evaluator, a set of questions designed to get a picture of where someone was and what they might need. The evaluator assigned to Elena's session was a civilian psychologist named Dr. Thomas Brecht, who had been doing this work for 3 years now. He was good at it. He had learned to not have expectations walking in, which was itself a thing you had to learn. Every person was different. You sat with them, where they were. He had read Elena's file. He had noted the obvious things. The trajectory from corporal to major in 14 months. The commendations. The engagement records. He had noted the less obvious things too, the letters home getting shorter. The communication gaps. The one flag from her unit's field assessment that said only, functioning at high capacity, and then nothing else, which was, in itself, a kind of data. She came in exactly on time. She sat down without fidgeting. She looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who has learned to assess things quickly and was now assessing him. He asked the standard questions. She answered them. Her answers were honest, he thought, but economical in the way that answers are economical when the person has thought about what belongs in this room and what doesn't. He asked how she was feeling about returning home. She looked at the wall behind him. Not in the way people look at walls when they're avoiding a question. In the way they look at walls when the question has reached something real, and they're deciding how to hold it. "I'll figure that out when I get there," she said. She said it as reassurance, as a simple, practical statement, as someone saying, "This is on my list. I'll get to it." He recognized that she meant it. He also recognized what the phrase contained, the distance it described between where she was and where there might be. He wrote something in his notes. He asked a few more questions. She answered them. The session ended at the right time, professionally, without incident. After she left, he sat with his notes for a while. He had been doing this work for 3 years. He had learned to not have expectations. He had learned that people carried things in ways that didn't always look like carrying. He wrote one more line in his notes and closed the file. It said, "Functioning at high capacity. Recommend continued check-ins." The thing she's carrying has no name yet. In the weeks after the armistice, the 61 species of the Concordat did what the Concordat was designed to do. They met, they communicated, they filed reports, and requested assessments, and arranged sessions, and began the slow institutional process of figuring out what had happened and what it meant. The process was necessary. It was also, in a private way that nobody said out loud in the formal sessions, somewhat beside the point. The important conversation was not happening in the assembly hall. It was happening in the offices and the corridors and the private transmissions between people who had been watching for 14 months and had come to certain conclusions that they were still deciding how to word. The conclusions were, loosely, something has changed. Not just the war, not just the outcome. Something in the shape of the galaxy itself, the way things related to each other, the unspoken arrangements and assumptions that held the Concordat together. The Concordat was built on a certain understanding of how power worked and where limits were, and what species could and couldn't do to each other. Those understandings had held for 11,000 years, because the species that held them had roughly similar answers to the same fundamental questions. Humanity's answers were not the same. Veth Kara, the Keth military officer who had walked into Orath Sen's office and closed the door, had been making calls since before the armistice. She had been quiet about it, careful about it, moving through the correct channels while also moving through the channels that existed alongside the correct ones. She had, by the time the signing ceremony happened, spoken personally to the defense representatives of 16 Concordat members. The conversations were not alarming. They were not about fear, not explicitly. They were about the kind of practical, forward-looking planning that responsible institutions do. They used words like integration and framework and clear expectations. What they were about, underneath the words, was the specific question of what you do when a new entity enters the room, and the room is too small for everything to stay where it was. Orath Sen knew about the calls. He was 400 years old. Very little happened in his vicinity that he didn't know about. He wrote his memo the day after the ceremony. Not to the Security Council, he had flagged that correctly from the start, that there would need to be an urgent session. He stood by that. But he also wrote something else. A personal document, filed in his private archive, not for circulation. It was not long. He was not a man who needed many words for the things that mattered most. It said, "I have been in this work for 400 years. I have seen wars start in ignorance and end in exhaustion, and leave the parties changed in ways that took decades to understand. I have seen species emerge from conflict with new relationships to themselves and to the galaxy. I know what that looks like. This looks different. I don't know what it looks like yet. That is, in my experience, the thing worth watching for." He sealed it, filed it. The city of the neutral station moved around him in its ordinary way. The assembly hall prepared for the next session. The archivists worked through their 11,000 pages. The transport ships that had moved humanity's forces across the galaxy for 14 months were beginning the long process of coming back. On one of them, heading toward Edmonton and fog, Elena Vasquez was looking out a viewport at the dark, between stars. She was not thinking about anything specific. This was still relatively new. The ability to be between thoughts without something filling the space. On the ground, there had been no between thoughts. There had only been the next thing, and then the thing after that, and the constant low current of attention that became, after a while, so much a part of her that she stopped noticing it. Now she was on a ship going home, and there were spaces between thoughts, and she was learning, again, what to do with them. She watched the dark. It was very large. She had understood that intellectually before the war. Now she understood it differently, in the way that you understand things differently when you've moved through them. She thought about Manitoba, about snow, about the coffee her mother made that was always too strong and that she had spent years pretending to like and had then, at some point she couldn't identify exactly, actually started to like. She was going home. That was the thing she had. That was enough to start with. In the Vorkai's administrative center, a long way from the signing ceremony and the archivists, and Orath Sen's memo, Sorath Vel was packing his office. He was retiring. His decision made cleanly, without drama. He had served 60 years. He had fought 19 engagements. He had written reports that future generations of Vorkai military students would study, which was a form of legacy he was comfortable with. The last 14 months were not something he expected anyone to find instructive. You couldn't teach what had happened. You couldn't put it in a manual. What you could do was note it, honestly, and let the people who came after make of it what they would. He took the reports he'd filed and put them in his personal archive. All of them. From They Don't Stop to the final assessment, 104 documents, representing the most uncertain and most honest writing he had ever done in a professional life built on certainty. He left one thing on his desk for whoever came next. Not a note, not a document, a small printed copy of the final casualty count, both sides, on one page. He left it because he thought whoever sat in this chair next should see it before they sat down. Should look at what the numbers meant, not just the Vorkai dead, which were significant and real, and would be in his mind until he wasn't alive to have things in his mind, but the human dead, the number that his models had called impossible, that the culmination point projections had said couldn't be sustained, that humanity had sustained anyway. He thought the next person should understand that, not as a tactical lesson, as a fact about what kind of galaxy they were in now. He put on his coat. He turned off the lights. He walked out. 3 years passed. Not quietly. Nothing was quiet in the 3 years after the war. There were sessions and summits and diplomatic frameworks and trade renegotiations, and a process called the Kessler Accord Review, which was the Concordat's careful, institutional way of asking, what do we do about the rules that didn't hold? There were inquiries into the Vorkai's original territorial claim. There were reports about Kessler's Rock, about what had happened to the people who survived it, about who was responsible for what, about what acceptable parameters meant when the species on the receiving end of them didn't think they were acceptable. The reports reached conclusions. The conclusions were filed. The filing was thorough. People who lost someone in the war did not find the filing helpful. This was expected and also true. On Kessler's Rock itself, which was now unambiguously human territory under every concordat framework that had been reviewed, the rebuilding had been going on since the armistice. New settlements, a memorial, simple and permanent, cut into the rock face on the edge of what used to be the settlement that the Vorkai had destroyed. The names were there, all 8,312 of them, in a script that was smaller than you expected until you started at one end of the wall and tried to reach the other, and understood why. Mayor Hollis Brandt, who had not asked for the job and had run unopposed 3 times, was in his 4th term. He had run for the 4th term because he had been there when it happened and felt, in the unclear way that duty sometimes presents itself, that he needed to still be there when the building back happened. He stood at the memorial sometimes, in the morning, before the day started. He didn't say anything. He didn't do anything specific. He just stood there. Darren Hollis, 3rd cousin, the man who had watched the first human ships arrive in the sky, had stayed on the rock. Most of the survivors had. Actually, more than the statistics predicted, more than the psychologists' models suggested would be the case. They had rebuilt in the same places, mostly, using different materials, with the particular stubbornness of people who had decided that leaving would mean something they didn't want it to mean. He had a small house, a garden, the kind that took work in Kessler's thin soil but produced something if you were patient. He grew a root vegetable that most people thought looked strange and tasted surprisingly good. He sat outside in the morning still, looking at the sky. The sky looked ordinary now. He was not sure whether that was a loss or a recovery. He had stopped needing to know. Ambassador Priya Anand had not been in the war. She needed to say this, sometimes, to people who looked at her across the table expecting something she hadn't earned. She had been a diplomat her entire career. Trade negotiations, resource treaties, the long, careful work of building agreements between parties who had different needs and the same limited supply of good faith. She was good at it. She was patient, specific, and had the quality that the best diplomats share. She could sit with discomfort without needing to resolve it quickly. She was 44 years old. She had 2 daughters and a long marriage to a man who taught secondary school mathematics and made very good soup. She had never held a weapon. She had spent the 14 months of the war at her desk and in conference rooms, and in the long, uncomfortable space of doing the work that needed doing, while other people were doing work she couldn't do, and couldn't fully understand from where she was standing. When the war ended and the diplomatic machinery began its grinding restart, she was appointed to represent humanity in the Concord's restructured General Assembly. It was a significant appointment. It was the right one, she was good at it, and humanity needed someone in that room who could sit across from 60 other species without the particular heaviness that the people who had been in the war carried, that they were careful about, but that was there, always, in the room with them. She accepted the appointment. She prepared extensively. She read the full war record, all 11,000 pages, which took 3 months and required, at several points, that she stop and sit with what she had read before she continued. She studied every diplomatic communication that had been filed during the conflict. She read Sevorin's field reports, which Concordat records had eventually flagged as exceptional observational value. She read the letter from the young desk worker who had stood up in the emergency session and said, "We didn't start this," and sat back down. She had found his name and sent him a personal message. He had written back 3 sentences, clearly uncertain what to do with the attention. She had appreciated the 3 sentences. The post-war session of the Concordat General Assembly was held 3 years after the armistice, which was how long the restructuring process had taken. The new frameworks were in place. The revised conventions were ratified. The hall was, as it had always been, soaring ceilings, soft light, and the 61 species were assembled. And the occasion was significant in the precise way that the Concordat handled significant occasions, which was with ceremony and documentation and the weight of 11,000 years of institutional memory. Priya Anand walked into the hall. She had prepared for this. She had done everything you could do to be ready for a room. She had the right clothes, the right notes, the right translations loaded, the right protocol memorized for every possible opening exchange, with every delegation she would need to address. She had not prepared for what the room did when she walked in. It went quiet, not the formal quiet of ceremony, not the respectful quiet of protocol. The other kind, the kind that falls over a space when something is present that everyone in the space has a relationship with, even if none of them can articulate that relationship cleanly. She felt it. She kept walking. She found her seat. She set down her notes. She looked at the room. 61 species. Some of them she knew by name, by face, by the particular way their expressions moved. Some were represented by people she had never met. All of them had been sitting in this hall, or in their equivalent of it, watching, for 14 months. All of them had received the transmissions and the records, and the casualty numbers, and the footage of the signing ceremony. All of them had, in one way or another, been doing what Orath Sen had done, sitting with a question they couldn't fully answer yet. Priya Anand was the first human to sit in this room since the war ended. She understood, suddenly and completely, what that meant. She looked at her notes. She looked at the room. She said, "Thank you for convening." Her voice was steady. She had made sure of that in the corridor. The session proceeded as sessions do. The new frameworks were formally entered into the record. The revised conventions were acknowledged. The representatives of various member states made statements that were measured and careful and contained. In the measured, careful spaces between their words, the thing that everyone in the room was aware of, but the session was not designed to address directly. It was Orath Sen who addressed it. He was still the Keth senior ambassador. He had considered, in the 3 years since the armistice, retiring. He had decided against it for a reason he had not shared with anyone. He wanted to be in the room for this. He felt he owed it to whatever it was he was supposed to understand, which he was still working on. He stood at the appropriate moment in the session. His voice had the quality it always had considered, genuine, weighted with years that were real rather than performed. He said, "I want to ask the human ambassador a question. It is not on the formal agenda. I am asking it for the record, and I am asking it because I think it is the question this assembly has not yet asked, and should." He looked at Priya Anand. "We watched your people fight for 14 months, he said. We watched you sustain what the models said was unsustainable. We watched you push through the losses and the time and the cost of this thing, and then we watched you win, and we are still 3 years later, trying to understand how." He paused. "Not tactically. We have the records. We understand the tactics. Or most of them. I mean something else. How does your species come back from something like that?" The room was very still. Priya Anand set her pen down. She had not prepared for this question, which was unusual for her and which she recognized, in the moment, as appropriate because this was not the kind of question you prepared for. This was the kind of question that required you to say the true thing without the benefit of having organized the true thing first. She looked at Orath Sen. "We haven't," she said. He blinked. "We came home," she said. "That's different." The room absorbed this. She let it. "Coming back from something," she continued, "means the thing is behind you, resolved, finished. It's in your past and you're separate from it now." She looked at her hands for a moment. "That's not what happens. What happens is you carry it forward. You go home, and the thing comes home with you, and you build a life around it. It's inside the life. It doesn't stop being there." She looked up. "But you're home," she said. "Your family is there. The coffee is the wrong temperature, and the season is changing, and there are things that need doing, and you do them, and you do them the next day. And at some point the thing you're carrying has become part of the shape of you, and you are still standing, and still moving. And that's what we call coming back." She stopped. The soft light of the assembly hall sat on everything evenly, the way designed light does, without preference. Orath Sen looked at her for a long time. "I don't know whether that's very sad or very strong," he said. "Yes," Priya Anand said. She picked her pen back up. The session continued. Elena Vasquez stood in her mother's kitchen on a Saturday morning in April. The window was open. The kind of open that April allows, not wide, not an invitation, just enough to let the season in at the edges. The air came through smelling like the specific mixture of mud and cold and something green just starting that meant the winter was actually, finally, done. She was holding a coffee mug. Her mother had made the coffee. It was too strong, which it had always been, which Elena had spent years pretending to like and which she now actually liked. And she wasn't sure exactly when the line between those two things had moved, but it had. She was not thinking about anything. This was still something she noticed. When it happened, the way you noticed the absence of a sound you'd grown used to. 3 years since the war ended. 3 years of the check-ins that Dr. Brecht had recommended, which had been useful in the way that having a place to put things is useful. 3 years of the relearning, of the mornings that were sometimes fine and sometimes not, and the trick of not needing to know in advance which kind they would be. 3 years of her mother's coffee. Her phone was on the counter. She had messages she hadn't answered yet. Her unit's informal group, which still talked, which talked more than she expected it to. Sergeant Osei had sent something yesterday, a picture of his daughter, who was 9 months old and was sitting up on her own for the first time and looked, in the photo, deeply surprised by this development. Elena had laughed at that photo. A real laugh, not a courtesy one. She had noticed the difference. She would answer the messages later. Right now she was holding her coffee and looking out the window at the yard, which her mother kept in a way that was not quite a garden but was not quite not a garden either. A compromise of a yard. Some grass, a few things that came back every year without being asked, a lilac bush in the corner that was not doing anything yet but would. Outside, a bird started arguing with something. The argument was small and urgent. Another bird, apparently, over something territorial, or food-related, or possibly just a difference of opinion. The birds went back and forth with total commitment, which Elena found, for reasons she had not examined, extremely funny. She listened to the whole thing. The argument resolved itself, in the way bird arguments do, which is messily, and without any clear winner, both parties flying off in different directions to reconsider their positions. She drank her coffee. The yard was quiet. The lilac bush was still not doing anything. The air still smelled like April. Elena Vasquez was 24 years old. She had fought a war. She had carried the war home and the war was still there, inside the shape of her days, not going anywhere. She knew this. She had stopped needing it to be different. She was in her mother's kitchen on a Saturday morning. The coffee was too strong. The season was turning. These were small things. She had understood, in the years since, that small things were the main event, not in a consolation prize way, in the way that water is most of what everything is not secondary to the solid parts, but the thing everything else is organized around. She had not asked for any of this. She had done it anyway. That was the thing. That was the human answer to Arath Sen's question. The version that didn't fit in a speech. The version that lived in kitchens and yards and too strong coffee and bird arguments on Saturday mornings. You do it anyway. And then you do the next thing. The galaxy had a word for what humanity had become. The word moved through 61 languages in 61 variations, and they weren't all the same word, because language is not a single thing across that much distance, but they pointed at the same thing. The word meant, roughly, the ones you do not want to push into a corner. It was not a compliment, exactly. It was not an insult, exactly. It was the specific word you use for a fact that makes you reconsider your arrangements. Humanity had a different word for itself. They had several, actually. They always did. They were a species that argued about their own nature, with the same energy they brought to everything else. Some of the words they used were generous. Some were not. The conversation had been going on for a long time and would continue, but if you pushed any of them, if you sat them down in a well-lit room and asked them, honestly, what they thought they were, most of them, most of the time, would say something like, people, or trying, or they'd shrug and say something that didn't translate well, and go back to what they were doing. Neither the galaxy's word nor humanity's got to the center of it. The center was somewhere in the space between them, in the carrying, in the continuing. In Arath Sen looking at a document he had not expected to see and understanding, finally, that the question was not what humanity could do. The question was what they would choose, and they would have to keep choosing. Every morning, every kitchen, every bird argument in every April that came after the war. That was the weight of it. That was also the point. Neither of them said it out loud. That was probably for the best.